This is a very complex and complicated matter.
That was Democratic Representative Barbara Lee of California on September 14th, 2001, 3 days after the events of 9/11, speaking on the floor about a vote on the authorization for the use of military force that was pending before the House of Representatives.
Some of us must urge the use of restraint. Some of us must say, let's step back for a moment. Let's just pause just for a minute and think through the implications of our actions today so that this does not spiral out of control.
Fast forward to December 2022, while the possibility of the war in Ukraine spiraling into World War III appears to be very real at this point, Representative Lee issued a joint statement with Representative Pramila Jayapal of Washington, the chair of the Congressional Progressive Caucus. The two issued the following statement in response to Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky's address to Congress. Quote, "Tonight, President Zelensky demonstrated the same bravery and defense of democracy that has rallied the United States and the world to his and the Ukrainian people's side in the 10 months since Russia's brutal, unjust, illegal invasion. Alongside President Biden, Vice President Harris, Speaker Pelosi, and our colleagues, we were pleased to welcome him to Washington and are proud to continue Democrats' support of the Ukrainian people's fight for sovereignty and democracy. We expect strong support from progressives for aid for Ukraine included in the year-end spending agreement. Our commitment to the Ukrainian people, in accordance with our progressive values for peace, diplomacy, and human rights around the world, will not wane." Closed quote. To try to understand the change in perspective that's taken place in Representative Lee over the past 20 years, we spoke with one of her colleagues and former co-member of the Congressional Black Caucus, former Representative Cynthia McKinney. We spoke with her via Skype from Bangladesh on Friday.
Dr. McKinney now, former Representative McKinney, you were in the room that day when she said that. What exactly has happened in the last, I guess it's 21 years?
Well, I think what happens, many things have happened, but I think one of the things that happens is that when one becomes comfortable and unchallenged in that very public position, then what can I say? There's less accountability. And so what we're seeing is less accountability across the board from all sectors of our elected officialdom. And that lack of accountability then has led to a delegitimization of the institution itself. And so I think electing different people to the institution is not going to be enough to solve this problem unless you do a wholesale change across the board and you reform the way in which people get into that institution, and then you eliminate the current people who have contributed to the rot of the institution.
You know, so you've got a few things sort of cooking at one time. Obviously, all of the polling of the public in terms of the positives and negatives towards Congress indicate exactly what you're saying. It's always been low for years now, but it's at an all-time low. The numbers are in high single or low double digits. And what's always been interesting to me is that you have, like say 10 to 20% positive and like a 98% reelection rate.
Right. And that's exactly where I was about to go.
Yeah.
So everyone says it's them, but it's not my representative. The problem is that it is your representative. It is that member of Congress who goes to Washington during the week and comes back home on the weekend, whether they're in the House of Representatives or the U.S. Senate, the bottom line is that they now are contributing to the rot, whether they got there last year or whether they have been there for 25 years. Of course, the rot originates with those who have been there for 25 years or more. And there are probably some that have been there longer than 25 years. Yeah, the ones who came in with me are still there and they haven't retired. So I would watch as my colleagues who came in with me would laugh at their constituents for basically them being able to game them or play them, and not just the constituents, but the other players, the stakeholders, the other stakeholders in this game. And that is the donors, the PACs, the labor unions. And I would watch them. They would try and get 50% here, 50% here, 50% here, 50% here, so they could get money from everybody. That was a game. Wow. Or they would just sort of laugh at their constituents and say, you know, I can tell them anything when I go back home. And they would cast the votes against their constituents, but the constituents didn't know anything more than what they were being told by that representative that had lost his or her principles or had lost their values. And, you know, many times it's not that people start out as bad people, but they become bad people when, absolute power corrupts absolutely. Yeah. Mm-hmm. And that's where we are when people don't hold their representatives accountable.
You know, it's interesting looking at this particularly with Barbara Lee in terms of her constituents on this particular question, the question of having a war with Russia, which, you know, much more, I think, risky proposition than, you know, giving George Bush the authorization that he was obviously going to have anyway. I mean, there was a game involved there, too. There were an awful lot of votes where her vote actually mattered. Her vote didn't matter there. She was the only person in the whole Congress that voted against it. And so it was going to be approved. It was 3 days after the planes hit everything and the whole country was in an uproar and nobody knew what to do. It was a shock to most people. Yeah. That was a pretty cheap thing for her. I mean, and her constituents actually backed her up for it, and she's been held out ever since as an example of principle on this particular vote, as she's approved every other military action and spending bill that's come across her desk, more or less, in the last 21 years. But this one, I'm curious, her constituents are among the most left-leaning ones in a congressional district in the country. And so I'm wondering why it is that she thinks that, or why it is that people that hold those values supposedly are in favor of this war or would at least allow her to be out front like this.
When you make that calculation, Barbara Lee and I were in the House anteroom together just before that House authorization vote. Yeah. When and we talked to Ron Dellums, and we were getting advice, just the two of us. And we were getting advice on how we were going to vote, because my whole being said that I was going to vote no. The difference in Barbara Lee and me was that I was going back home to Georgia, and she was going back home to Berkeley.
Right.
And so I ended up casting a vote against my values and against my principles, because I knew that there was absolutely no way that I could explain to even my staunchest supporters in Georgia that this was a scam. I mean, I've said it subsequently.
Oh, yeah, you were out front.
And no one, even at that time, very few people, I won't say no one, but very few people believed me when I talked about the electronic voting machines. Look at what we're dealing with now. I talked about the electronic voting machines back in 1990 something.
Right, that's right.
And very few people believed me. I was not able to carry the weight of the day. So going back to Georgia, I went against my principles and I voted yes on the authorization of the use of force. Barbara Lee voted no, but she went back to Berkeley. Now, the situation is changed. So she goes back to Berkeley, but it's a vastly different scenario now because she voted with her conscience and with her constituency then. Now, she must not be voting with her conscience, and she's also voting against her constituency.
Yeah.
But the lack of accountability permits the lack of integrity.
Yeah, that's the problem. There is no day of reckoning at the ballot box anymore, and that's the problem. Cynthia McKinney, thank you so much for your time, and we will be speaking with you again very soon.
For KPFK, I'm Don DeBar.